Well, good afternoon. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm wearing a number of different hats today. I'm the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy. I also am the president and CEO of a new organization, Save the Persecuted Christians. I'm here in my capacity as the vice chairman of the new Committee on the Present Danger, China, and serving kind of as a master of ceremonies, I guess, for the cat herding that will be involved in getting through this program shortly. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here, and for those of you who are joining us by live stream and through the miracle of modern media telecommunications. We have a lot of very impressive folks who are going to be speaking in the course of the day. We've also tried to build into the program some time for discussion. It's billed as a roundtable discussion. In fact, we have 10 roundtables, and we're going to try to make sure that we also have adequate time for a conversation with our guests and members of the new Committee on the Present Danger, China, who are here in quite some number. I just want to take a minute before introducing our chairman, Brian Kennedy, to put into some context, historical context, what makes this effort so important, we think. And that is that when I was a young man, there have been actually several iterations of the Committee on the Present Danger, but one that was particularly consequential was one that operated in the 1970s. Some of you, like me, are old enough to remember the 1970s. In that particular moment, there was something called the Evil Empire by Ronald Reagan, the Soviet Union. He ran for president in 1980 on a platform of trying to defeat the Soviet Union. And I believe absolutely instrumental to his ultimate success in doing just that was an organization, a pickup team, if you will, that came together, made up of national security practitioners, of subject matter experts, of business leaders, of human rights activists, of champions of religious freedom, under the banner of the Committee on the Present Danger. And it helped then, actually not even candidate Reagan, who joined the Committee on the Present Danger, to begin thinking about a strategy for accomplishing the defeat of the USSR, and ultimately helped enormously, I think, in his efforts to campaign on that as a key piece of his platform in 1980. And every bit as important, following his election as president, members of the Committee on the Present Danger wound up staffing his administration and executing the strategy that they had developed, which in due course did bring down the totalitarian communist regime that sought the destruction of this country and the enslavement of the rest of the world. This is the inspiration. This is the model that we very much aspire to emulate in the current Committee on the Present Danger, China. And we've gotten off, I think, to a splendid start in this room about 2 weeks ago. We had the rollout of the committee. And I think certainly in my time in Washington, I've never seen anything quite like it. We had 21 members of the committee participating in the launch, each of whom were asked, and more or less did, confine themselves to 4 minutes to present their insights into specific parts of the problem that we're facing with China. Specifically, what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, pretty much to pick up where the old Soviet Union left off, namely to bring down this country, defeat it, and supplant it as the world's dominant power with the objective of literally dominating the world. So I commend to all of you the wonderful videos. I like to think they're viral ready for social media purposes at presentdangerchina.org. And to review them, to share them, and otherwise help us make sure that we accomplish what the earlier incarnation of this team did, namely raising awareness about the threat and, as importantly, developing, if possible, a widespread consensus within the country at both the policy-making level and among the American people about taking the steps we must to protect ourselves and to defeat this generation's present danger. With that, I will turn the microphone over to the chairman of this group, Brian Kennedy. I think many of you probably know him from his extraordinary service as the president of the Claremont Institute out in California. He served in that capacity for some 13 years. These days, he's the president of the American Strategy Group and a senior fellow and board member of the Claremont Institute, as well as, of course, the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. Welcome, Brian.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Frank Gaffney, for your organization of today's roundtable and for all you do here in Washington. And thank you for everyone who joined us, as Frank said, back on March 25th when we rolled out the Committee on the Present Danger, China. Our purpose with these meetings is to alert our countrymen on the existential threat posed by the People's Republic of China under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, it's not fashionable here in Washington to speak of existential threats. On the other hand, everything has become an existential threat. If you don't have the Washington Nationals winning the pennant, it's an existential threat. But people don't really like to talk about the serious things. They rather talk about the unserious things. They don't like to talk about as if our country could be destroyed by a foreign power or our economy undermined or our way of life fundamentally ended. We used to think about that at one time in this country. This does not fit well today with concerns about the stock market and whether it is up or down. It does not make for simple explanations on the evening news. To say the least, if the existential threat by the PRC were widely understood, the committee wouldn't even be necessary. Alas, it is not. It is our purpose to provide evidence about the future of our country and the intentions of the People's Republic of China through these discussions, so that serious people can debate both the facts and evidence and what should reasonably be done. We submit these presentations to reasonable people in the hopes of uncovering a path forward. It is an unfortunate remnant of the end of the Cold War that there has developed this belief in the inevitable decline of totalitarian powers, as if somehow all totalitarian powers are destined to collapse of their own accord. That because the Soviet Union reorganized into Russia and its constituent parts, that somehow the inherent failings of communism are bound to infect communist China as well. That it was, or it really is, merely a question of time before the communist regime in Beijing gives way to freedom and democracy. We mean with these meetings to explain that such thinking is misguided and not useful for the free people of the United States and their representatives as they make policy about how they should secure their freedom. The Soviet Union was forced to reorganize its empire, more commonly called the collapse of the Soviet Union, because of a series of policies and actions, as Frank suggested, conceived by the Committee on the Present Danger and executed by the Reagan administration. President Reagan and 39 members of the committee who joined his administration, and I hasten to add that Reagan himself was a member of the committee, believed that something had to be done, that only through very specific policies, namely the rebuilding of the U.S. military, economic strategies to limit the Soviet Union's access to Western capital, and a commitment to build a national missile defense, did the Soviet Union lose the challenge of the Cold War and were forced to reorganize its empire. It was not inevitable or even likely. Instead, it was well thought out, debated in forums like this, and later implemented by the men and women of the Reagan administration who defended President Reagan's policies. Today, under the presidency of Donald Trump, we are seeing, in my view, an equally serious stance toward the threats this country faces, especially the threats of Communist China. President Trump, like Reagan before him, understands this threat and is taking actions to ensure our national survival. President Trump has pledged to rebuild the U.S. military, to remake trade deals with China that benefit the American people, most especially the American worker, to ensure that China does not steal our intellectual property or engage in onerous business practices like forced technology transfers. President Trump has taken the bold step of announcing the U.S. Space Force that will limit the strategic designs of the People's Republic of China. And it is in this process of building a robust national missile defense. No more serious commitment could be made than that by President Trump, and it is much needed, and he is much in need of our help. The Chinese Communist Party, like that of the Soviet Union, has proven to be highly adaptable. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is the most sophisticated political ideology known to man. It is at once totalitarian and capitalist. It blends free markets and mercantilism and masks the dangers inherent in dealing with such systems in the prospects of big returns for U.S. businesses seeking to make big profits. I should add here that an additional challenge that we in the United States have is our affection for the people of China, literally millions of whom now live in the United States and the West, or whom we have engaged in business. When we Americans think of China, we harbor no animosity toward the people of the country, but rather the Communist Party and all of its manifestations. China has developed the Communist Party into an intellectual vanguard that has had the ability to guide the people of China into the 21st century and lead a powerful industrial nation with the capability of being the most dominant military nation on earth. That is no small achievement. Indeed, far from their demise being inevitable and relegated to the ash heap of history because of their totalitarian ways, when it comes to China, quite the opposite is true. Because of their ability to build a modern industrial economy with interwoven financial relationships between the Communist Party and their state-owned enterprises, and control 1.3 billion people through regulating social media and the threat of repression, they've established the Communist Party as the model for modern progressive government. So long as this is so, hope for a free China and a safe free world is in doubt. America's great faith in itself, its principles, and its belief in human freedom is being restored under President Trump. Our great challenge is to muster the national will to check the resilience and genius of Chinese communism. It is our hope with today's roundtable to advance our understanding of the Chinese Communist Party and bring together those strategic and national security minds to address and debate these issues. Thank you again for being with us here today.
Thank you, Brian. I want to just make sure that everybody has their hands on. If you haven't, please get it downstairs, I guess, or just borrow somebody else's, which I just did. Just a short description of the committee and the mission statement that we see for it and the guiding principles that have brought us together. And our hope is that we will find many more folks. This is sort of the founding team that is listed in the attachment, but we're looking for many more good men and women who will embrace these principles and help us in the mission of educating, as I said, and arousing and equipping our countrymen and women to rise to the present danger. one manifestation, and we'll be going through a number of them in the course of this program, of the imminent and potentially very fraught danger is what the Xi Jinping regime in China, the Chinese Communist Party he leads, has in mind for the nation, and I use that term deliberately, of Taiwan. And a man who has just returned from there and who has spent many years both in connection with Taiwan and in connection with the state of affairs in his native China, is, I'm pleased to say, with us. His name is Lian Chao Han. He was a student activist in his youth back in the 70s in, among other places, Hunan. He helped champion the idea that there should be free elections in China. Needless to say, this did not endear him to the regime of the day, nor has it in the years since. It has, however, endeared him to all of us who hope for the Chinese people that they too will enjoy the freedom that unfortunately many of us take for granted, but that we know must now be defended against the Chinese Communist Party. Lian Chao Han, will you join us and tell us a little bit about the CCP's, Chinese Communist Party's, threat to Taiwan, among other free nations?
Good afternoon. My name is Lian Chao Han. I work at Citizen Power Initiative for China. And I just got back from Taiwan, which is a great trip, very impressive. But I also saw the China's threat firsthand. I saw there are many experts, true experts on Taiwan here. And I'm just want to express my view about what I see the major threat in Taiwan. I hope the experts will join us to discuss the issue. Tomorrow is going to mark the 40th anniversary of Taiwan Relation Act. And of course, that this TRA has helped to mitigate the negative impact of Carter administration abandoning Taiwan. However, it may not be reflect today's geopolitical situation in East Asia, nor provide adequate protection for Taiwan. I will discuss that later in my talk. So it needs a complete review and updating. This is critical because the Chincom's threat to Taiwan is imminent. And that because Taiwan's very survival and Taiwan people's life are on the line. From Nixon administration to Obama administration, the US had made so many mistakes in regard of Taiwan. The biggest mistake, I think, is walk right into the CCP's trap, one China trap. I think that's the biggest mistake. The Chincom's goal, the Chinese Communist CCP's goal on Taiwan is to seize and occupy the island at all costs. Since Xi Jinping took power, the regime has been intensifying all front assaults on Taiwan, against Taiwan. Xi Jinping believes take over Taiwan is his historic mission, a part of his China dream, and a great national rejuvenation. 40 years ago, when US and China re-established, normalized so-called diplomatic relationship, And the Chinese regime made a Taiwan statement, which shifting its policy from so-called liberation to peaceful unification. But the matter of fact is, nothing much really changed. The CCP has been aiming to subdue Taiwan without fighting. But it also created so many narratives, such as the Chinese don't fight against Chinese, people across the street are the same family, and the shared destiny of the people across the street. But it has never stopped preparing for using military force to seize and occupy Taiwan. They have a grand strategy, and they're following the playbook step by step to make sure Taiwan become part of China. I'm going to talk about four areas that how China's threat becomes so damaging, so imminent. One is on political side, and second, military side, the third, economic side, and then diplomacy. So on the political side, Chinese regime knows better that the fortress is the easiest to break from within. How many time do I have?
4 minutes.
4 minutes?
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Smartly.
Okay. So what they do in the political side is they launch political warfare against the political system. And they create, basically, it's the division and conquer strategy. They create divisions among the parties, political parties. I mean, KMT and the DPP. And also they create divisions within the parties to cause them, to make them collapse. I think that's, you can see clearly from the beginning, very beginning, this is almost 30 years back, almost 40 years back. They've been doing this, the political warfare, political influence for many, many decades. And KMT, in the end, is totally collapsed and corrupted by the Chinese government. And the tools they use, the most effective tools they use, is to funnel financial, economic benefits, interests into KMT elites. Many KMT's children, retired generals, and government officials, all went China, make tons of money. In the process, they become pro-Chinese communist regime. If you look at today, they're celebrating, they commemorate Chiang Kai-shek's 44th anniversary of his death. And during the ceremony, nobody talked about anti-communism. Anti-communism was a core for Chiang Kai-shek. Nobody talked about that anymore. The premier of Taiwan, Huo Bo-chun, defense minister, he was compared Xi Jinping as Sun Yat-sen, as the founding father of ROC. And also he also praised One Belt, One Road as Xi Jinping salvation or helping the poor of the world. So this type of situation, you can see that KMT completely corrupt. And now the next target is the DPP. They create divisions among DPP. And they also use projects, big projects, to help DPP elites get money and divide them, conquer them. This is happening right now. And then at the same time, they create their own political parties. They have about a few dozens of pro-Chinese regime organizations, political parties. And one of the two, I think, one is they call White Wolf, his political party, promotes Reunification Party. Another one is Association for Patriotic Alliance. Both are very confrontational, violent, openly advocate communist ideas and use violence, use verb abuse to make a noise. A friend of mine who supported Taiwan independence gave a talk in Taiwan a few years back. He was beaten by those political party members. So this type of political corruption is everywhere. You can see they have a truck, they have a Chinese red flag, they have the propaganda trucks driving around Taipei now. And the situation, I think, it's almost, it's unbelievable. So, okay, I'm gonna, I don't have time to, I want to talk about military harassment, military coercion. China never failed to prepare for military action against Taiwan. If you look at how much money they spent on military, they built aircraft carriers. They have these missiles, 1,200 to 2,000 target on Taiwan. They have submarines, 59 compared to Taiwan's 2 operational submarines. And they have 5 nuclear submarines. And it's almost impossible for Taiwan to catch up. But under TRA, the U.S. is supposed to provide adequate defense technology, materials, arms cells. But that technology, that arms cells never catch up with China's rapid arm race, military modernization. So, and then on the economic side, China create economic dependency for Taiwan. You look at Taiwan's export, most Taiwan's export went to China, 40%. And Taiwanese businessmen, there are about 2 million businessmen working in mainland China. They're all become part of agents, part of Chinese United Front work to promote unification. And you have to work with them, support the agenda to be able to make money. They use that as a leverage against and lure them and to promote their agenda. And that created the economic independence of Taiwan. Without break away from that, even Tsai Ing-wen has this southbound policy. I think without U.S. help, it may not work effectively. Lastly, I think diplomacy. Taiwan is the best country. If we have to vote for a model member of the global village, Taiwan would be the top on our selection. But Chinese government use all this leverage to force, to so-called shave Taiwan's head. Basically, they want 0 diplomatic countries that has, the countries has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. The reason is they want to, no country recognize Taiwan's sovereignty so they can invade Taiwan. So this is, I think Taiwan is in a, right now, Taiwan has only 17 countries that has a diplomatic relationship. And before, in the 70s, it was 70 countries, and it dropped to 17. China, on the other hand, at the 70, during the 1970s, have had about 50. Now it's 170. I think these mistakes made. The reason is, I think, what's behind the reason, they want to squeeze the international space of Taiwan, so when they invade Taiwan, nobody come to Taiwan's help, because legally they can see that's part of China. So, okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
It's extremely painful to foreshorten that really important presentation, but thank you for getting through it despite my efforts to do that, nonetheless. I just want to ask if, Morgan, you might give Rick Fisher the microphone. This is a few minutes for discussion. Rick is one of our members of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. He's also one of America's leading experts on the Chinese military. And he has been warning now for some time that, as Lian Chao has just said, the capabilities that the Chinese have been inexorably building are increasingly sufficient to accomplish this conquest. Would you take 2 minutes, Rick, and just give us that essential point?
Certainly, Frank, and thank you for this micro forum. 15 years ago, in conferences full of private sector and other sector participants, the common joke was any Chinese invasion of Taiwan would constitute a million-man swim. It was a way of laughing it off, essentially. Today, it is my estimation that using roughly 2,000 Boeing and Airbus airliners alone, if PLA airborne forces were able to take control of the major large airfields in Taiwan, that airliners alone could put about 5 million soldiers and other support troops in Taiwan within a month. The PLA is also noted quite often for not having a large, formal amphibious assault capability, LPDs, LHDs, and the such. This will come. By the 2030s, there will be amphibious assault fleets that will be roaming the world. But for now, you occasionally pick up articles in the Chinese web about the mobilization of the Yangtze River Basin. Back in about 2006, 2007, Chinese Ministry of Transportation officials worked with the United Nations and provided us a count. The Chinese have about 50,000 barges that ply the Chinese rivers. We saw the Chinese use maybe 100 or 200 of those barges to build all those new bases in the South China Sea about 4 or 5 years ago. If there was going to be an invasion of Taiwan, in addition to the airliners, the PLA could mobilize multiple waves of at least 10,000 barges each to transport its forces, armor, whatnot, to Taiwan. So the threat to Taiwan is real and real, very real today. Instead of dithering about whether we sell Taiwan 66 F-16s or maybe a few F-35s, we need to be selling Taiwan the capability to manufacture 20 or 30,000 cheap medium-range cruise missiles to take out those invasion fleets. That kind of capability will keep Xi Jinping on his side of the strait.
Rick, thank you very much. Bill Gertz from the Washington Free Beacon and Washington Times, one of the country's premier investigative reporters, national security journalists, and authors of several books on this very subject. Bill, welcome
thanks,
back.
Frank. My comment is to, I think, really to look at how Taiwan fits within Chinese strategic deception. And I think that one of the areas where the committee could really focus would be on a review of intelligence failures related to China. And I think Taiwan plays large in that spectrum. As someone who's covered China and written about China for more than 30 years, I can tell you that year after year, our intelligence agencies put forth the incorrect notion that China's ambitions for its military and its economics and its political, its military power, essentially, was only directed at developing a force that could retake Taiwan. There were voices within the government that opposed this, including Mike Pillsbury, and yet year after year, the annual military power report from the Pentagon would always have this conciliatory language that China's really not, doesn't have global ambitions, but only wants a military that will take over Taiwan. Now we know that this has been totally false, and it's just one of the many failures that has been the result of strategic deception on the part of Beijing. There are other failures as well in terms of monitoring their buildup, but I think it would be really valuable for the committee to focus some of its resources and efforts to looking at the intelligence failures related to China.
Good, thank you. This is very much appreciated because we are, as Brian Kennedy said earlier, very much in the process of mapping out the next steps and the most effective way we can contribute. So I appreciate that especially, Bill. Mark Stokes, the Executive Director of the Project 2049 Institute, another member of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, and foremost expert on what China has in mind for all of us by 2049, if not considerably before. Mark.
Thank you, Frank. Sometimes I can barely think to this afternoon, much less to 2049. But thank you very much.
But they do.
Yes, sir. They do indeed. I would like just to make a quick added couple comments to Han Lian Chao's absolutely magnificent comments here, as well as Bill and Rick here. To me, the objective reality is that Taiwan, under its existing Republic of China Constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state. Its existence is different than the way that we deal with it. It's a policy issue. But I would note that just in that first, Hao Bo-sun is not really KMT per se. I think he left the party in early 1990s. But generally within the KMT, there's different factions, I would say, or different fundamental beliefs. But since the Ma administration, their view of one China, there's one China. Taiwan is part of China, but that China is ROC, and that ROC consists, Republic of China, consists of two areas: Taiwan area, mainland area. So what they're implicitly saying, and I agree, they probably wouldn't admit this or even highlight this point, but what they seem to be saying is that the legitimate, if there is one China, which includes both sides of the Taiwan Strait, then that legitimate government is the ROC. It's actually a democracy. So just want to make that point. Sort of, it's implicit, but something we should keep in mind. Secondly, about 5 years ago or so, an analyst named Peter Mattis published a interesting piece in the National Interest that that called upon the public and analysts to think carefully about a possible scenario, maybe unlikely, but possible scenario, and that's a catastrophic collapse of central order in the People's Republic of China, where the Communist Party loses control. If you think in these terms, in terms of what would be U.S. policies and how we would respond to this, and you think through the potential role of Taiwan, or the ROC, whatever term you want to use, you sort of place Taiwan in a much more significant light and potential role in being a partner for the United States in this unlikely but very possible scenario. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. Morgan, if you could bring the microphone over here to Sasha Gong. Sasha is another member of the Committee on the Present Danger. She formerly directed the Mandarin service, the China service for the Voice of America. She was imprisoned in China for her opposition to the regime in her misspent youth, and we're delighted that she's here to bear witness to what we're facing, and specifically, if you could comment on how this Chinese operation, the influence elements of it and information operations are playing out vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Yeah, actually, when you think of it, if you go to Shanghai, you see Taiwanese people everywhere. And once I interviewed a Chinese official, and he told me about 10% of Taiwan's vote is in Shanghai. So when you think of it, what that was...
Say that again, 10% of what?
10% of Taiwan's vote. When
Vote.
Taiwan is democracy, but the vote is in China. And well, that was 10 years ago. And at this point, I think perhaps 15%, and I don't have the number. So what happened is that when you go to the Taiwanese community, you all know the Chinese have injected enormous influence in all the Taiwanese communities in order to influence the Taiwanese vote, and especially also in the United States, and so something I think we need to pay attention to, how the Chinese operate in the Taiwanese community, in China and here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is really an important point that Chinese diaspora, I think, we'll wind up hearing more about in the course of the day. I'm very pleased to have another of our distinguished members of the committee, Bob Fu. Dr. Pastor Bob Fu is another Chinese student activist who has made his way to our country, become a citizen. He now runs China Aid and is a man who has also recently been in Taiwan. Bob, we're very pleased to have you with us.
Thank you, Frank. Just a quick point, really, about what Lian Chao talked about, the China's kind of penetrating impact in the Taiwan society. I mean, it's really they're adopting a very same playbook as they have been doing dealing with the Western free societies, that they are using their so-called sharp power, not hard or soft power, basically financial and propaganda, to take advantage of the free society, all the freedoms. I mean, we were in Taiwan just with Lian Chao, and we see the CCP's flag. I mean, the Communist Party's flag. It's not only the PRC's flag. The CCP's flag was being being transported and being broadcast. I mean, in a mobile, in a vehicle around the Taipei street, broadcasting the propaganda. How much, Taiwanese or Chinese who hold a flag of the Republic of China would be arrested, would be immediately thrown into prison. And one project I want to, maybe the committee, somehow we can focus on is to study how much media independence in Taiwan society right now. If you turn on TV in Taiwan, of course, we still cherish this 23 million people democracy. But if you watch on the Taiwanese the TV station or newspaper, read the newspaper editorials, how much percentage left, Mark, right? Not much, but they're extremely one-sided. When the election, like midterm election in Taiwan happened, one DPP candidate posts of her platform on Facebook, immediately, over 3 million kind of cyber kind of hits anonymously, and almost taken down her Facebook just for promoting independence or freedom of Taiwan. So that might be a worth project. We can do a research and see, the money trail that who are funding this Taiwan's media. Maybe 90% are already belong to the Confucius Institute, kind of the same funding source, the propaganda department of the Communist Party. So I want to raise this issue.
Terrific.
Yeah, thank you.
Bob, thank you both for that comment and for your leadership on raising the alarm. We'll be talking about it momentarily or in the course of the afternoon, what the Communist Chinese Party is doing to people of faith in China. Let me turn to our two presenters so far, Brian Kennedy and Lian Chao, to wrap up this discussion.
Thank you, Frank. I guess my question would be for Lian Chao, actually. Why should Americans care about Taiwan? I worry that this is the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, but that many Americans, especially those who, all the young people who grew up long after the end of the Cold War, they don't appreciate what these things really mean. Maybe you could just say something about that. Why should Americans care?
I think that's a great question. Thank you. The reason I mentioned before, we need to update TRA and Taiwan policy, U.S. Taiwan policy. The reason is that all this Taiwan policy formulated before Taiwan became a democracy, a real democracy. So in the late 70s, early 80s, even the sixth assurance by President Reagan, that's still before Taiwan become democracy. Taiwan right now is a beacon of democracy in Asia, and recognize universal value, recognize the American value, and be a very loyal partner of United States. If we don't defend Taiwan, I think that will mark the decline of America as a free country, as a democracy, as the leader in the free world. I think it's critical for the United States to make sure we come to Taiwan's help, because the fundamental geopolitical situation has changed, and we no longer need China to balance the Soviet Union, and Taiwan become a democracy, and that changed everything. And if we don't support Taiwan, I think right now the only thing that stopped China to invade Taiwan is the United States. They were not sure, they are still not sure whether U.S. will interfere or not. But in the TRA, it's one-sided, unilateral imposed obligation. It's not treaty obligation. So China will always test the water, how far United States can tolerate, what cost United States would bear to defend Taiwan. We need to make that clear. Otherwise, a new president come to power, to the White House, he may have a different view about national interests. So we need a clear review of TRA and update of to reflecting the current situation of Taiwan. Thank you.
Well, and I think as has been said, but it's worth repeating, the Trump administration has done more with respect to living up to the spirit as well as the letter of the TRA than any president, I think, since it was enacted. The trouble is, ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear. If we don't deter China, this will be a horrible loss for the free world in general, not just Taiwan, because it will absolutely, positively confirm China's confidence, Xi Jinping's China dream, that it will secure the dominant position in the world, and it will be harder and harder and harder to stop them, to say nothing of the horrific losses that will be entailed, probably, most especially for the people of Taiwan, but quite possibly for a lot of American servicemen and women who might be sent into harm's way to try to prevent that outcome. Gentlemen, we thank you very much for your contribution to this part of the program, and to all of you who've spoken. I'm very pleased to say, with the precision of a B-1 bomber pilot, our next speaker has arrived right on time. I don't know how many of you know him. He is a man I've come to admire tremendously, both for his past service to our country in the uniform of the United States Air Force. I'm fond of telling this tale that he set the world record for round-the-world transport on an aircraft by flying his B-1B bomber, with some help from his friends in the United States Air Force, to be sure, to achieve that record. It's remarkable, but it's only one of the many things that I could tell you about, but I'm cutting into his time. He is these days the congressman from the 2nd District of Utah. His name is Representative Chris Stewart. I'm extremely pleased that he's here, especially as he brings with it the expertise he has been developing both in uniform and as a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And you have volunteered to talk about the assault by the Chinese Communist Party on intellectual property in this country and privacy. Congressman Stewart, thank you. Welcome.
I'm a huge fan of Frank's. We've known each other since I think my first year in Congress, which is about 6 years ago, and been on his radio program and other events with him, and someone that I I deeply respect his commitment to defense of freedom and defense of democracy, and thank you for your continued efforts there. He did talk about the fastest nonstop flight around the world. That was a lot of fun. Turns out flying jets is a lot more fun than being in Congress, if any of you want to know. I can assure you of that. And also being on time. I used to take great pride in saying I could fly a 17 or 21-hour mission, drop bombs plus or minus 1 second, which is pretty cool, which is why I hate being late, and I won't be long. I've been given 15 minutes, and that's all I'll take, and you guys would rather hear from, I think Senator Cruz is coming after me anyway, is that right? Oh, you guys don't want to hear from Ted. I'll just keep going with that. And I'm going to correct, just maybe we miscommunicated or not. I just think my view on this isn't necessarily on trade or intellectual property, although that's a part of what I will discuss here. It's more a view of China and the challenges we have there from an intelligence perspective, which would make sense with my background there. I'm going to ask you to respond to this question, and I was out speaking at the space conference in Colorado Springs yesterday. Asked this question again. People who space is more than just space. It's obviously military and intelligence and other things as well. And I asked this of different groups, and I'm going to ask this, then I'm going to make the point. How many of you think that the rise of China and their ambitions is the greatest threat facing our nation generationally from a national security perspective? Raise your hand if you agree with that. Okay, no surprise in this room. It's part of the reason is because you're here, you obviously have an interest in that. I can tell you this, that if I asked that to a group of people I think in Washington, D.C., just a group of normal folks, and if I asked that to a group of just normal folks, which I am, by the way, just a very normal folk, but if I just ask a group of people back home, you don't get that response. And you certainly didn't get that response 2 years ago or 3 or 4 years ago. You're beginning to get that response a little bit more now. And it's very, very important that we do. And I'm going to tell parts of the same story, phase 1 and phase 2, and then make my point and then come back and conclude with this. Had an opportunity to meet with President Xi about 5 years ago. First time I'd met him, we were there with a couple other senators and one other congressperson. And we had a chance, because of a small group, to spend really quite a lot of time with him. And I remember asking him about this principle, this idea that many of you are familiar with, and I always butcher the name because I've been mispronouncing it for turns out 30 years, but the Thucydides principle, and I mispronounce it there now, I think, but I've heard it mispronounced or pronounced about a dozen different ways. But it is this idea that you all are familiar with, the Greek philosopher who said if you have an established power and then a rising power, that they will always come into conflict. You're familiar with this idea? Well, most of us are. And if you look at history, if you look at the last 500 years of history, it's about 80% of the time that proves to be true, which is, a notable amount. And I discussed this with the president and asked him his view on this, and he adamantly disagreed. He said, I don't believe that at all. We don't believe that as leadership. We think there's plenty of room for the United States and for us to exist and to have our spheres of influence and to have our own ambitions and our own goals, and that they don't have to collide. And I appreciated that. Now here's the reality. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute because there's a little bit more to that story. From an intelligence perspective, there's nothing that I worry about more, and I have plenty of things to worry about. We have briefings almost weekly, or as some of the staff on the committee will recognize, that we leave those briefings many times. Your jaw's on the floor, right? And you just think, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Or how are we going to deal with this? Or what's the answer to this? On a wide range of topics. You could talk about nuclear proliferation. You could talk about the mullahs in Iran. You could talk about the KGB thug who is leading the Soviet Union and will lead that until the day he dies. I'm sure he's not going to step down and go to the beach house and fish his last 20 years of his life. And the list is long. You want to talk cyber, you want to talk bio. By the way, if you want to see some interesting things, look at bio and some of China's initiatives there. But nothing worries me quite like China, and I say all the time, they are the generational challenge that my children are going to have to figure out how we deal with this. Because, in 20 years, Russia will be led by a KGB thug, but they're not going to be that generational challenge that China presents to us. Belt Road Initiative, everyone in this room understands that. Most Americans don't. And I preach that all the time. Frank, how much time do I have? Till a quarter after it? Okay. I talk to people all the time, go Google Belt Road. Go read about the Belt Road Initiative. And, understand that, the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Communist Party in China, what their intentions are by 2048, that 100th anniversary. And in my view, and I think this is informed, although I don't think they would describe it this way, but I think the way I'm about to describe it is exactly their intentions, and that is they're not going to be a peer of the United States. That's not satisfying to them. That's not their intention. Their intention is to dominate the United States and every other Western or free democracy. That is their intentions, to dominate, to be the preeminent power politically, militarily, diplomatically, economically, and other areas as well. And they're moving methodically towards that goal. Now, they're having a few stumbles along the way, and I'm not naive. I understand as well that they have some challenges. They have some internal challenges that are significant. But I believe that they are creative and committed, and that they will deal with those challenges and not allow those to dissuade them or to move them away from this ultimate goal of what the Belt Road Initiative will lead to. By the way, if you've been to Djibouti or you're familiar with Djibouti, this is a great indicator of what that will look like. And if you go talk to the people and the leaders who are, affected by that policy that they agreed to several years ago, almost without exception, they regret that. And when you look at the domineering influence, the dominant influence, and how they're treated now as if they are not the sovereign power within the confines of their own country. They're essentially told, well, I know that's what the agreement says, but this is what we're going to do. And we understand that, yeah, you are the premier or you're the vice chairman or whatever position of authority might be, but this is what we're going to do. And that's an important model for us to broadcast and to advertise so that others who are considering these other types of partnerships are aware. I mean, the leadership in Djibouti should be the advocate. They should be the people that we're pushing out there all over the world to say, if you think this is a good idea, talk to these people and ask them what their experience has been and whether they're glad they did it and whether the cost benefit has worked out to their benefit, because they would not make that claim any longer. And that's a resource that we need to take advantage of. The Confucianism centers around the country that all of you, I suppose, are familiar with. And we're finally now having some success with getting prominent and preeminent universities, not just, small state universities or two-year colleges that many of us have never heard of, and I'm not going to mention them here, but prominent universities who are finally taking a second look at that and saying, this isn't what it's purported to be. And if you want to test that, have a couple of your professors at those universities be vocal and critical of China and see the hell that raises down on them from within their own university. That's a coordinated effort to stifle those types of voices. And that's what gets their attention, when their own people fall under pressure and attack because they said something that was disagreeable to some of the leaders of the local Confucianism Institute or some other leaders. The one I have to talk about, and it's one that's good news and bad news, and the bad news is that it's an incredible threat and many people are ignorant of them. The good news is that, like some of these others, we're beginning to help people understand. And that is, you're partnering with China in a technological realm. You're nuts if you have Huawei or ZTE equipment anywhere in your system or supply chain. And by the way, for someone from the former administration who held a very senior position at the National Security Council within the White House, and then to go lobby, and you all know who I'm talking about, Mr. Jane, because I just think it's difficult for me to understand that there's not a conflict there between what is in our, we know, national interest and protecting American freedom and democracy and privacy. And you can't say, well, Huawei's just another technological company, because they're not. And we're helping people, and people are beginning to understand that they're not. And so I should say kudos to AT&T and some others who at a very significant cost, billions of dollars in some cases, have re-looked at their business model and said, it's not worth it to us. And we're going to re-look at these business relationships. And we need to congratulate them. The DNI, who is a man I greatly admire, and their efforts to go out and talk to CEOs, not CTOs, not CFOs, not COs, to the boss, and to read them into some classified information to help them understand the real nefarious foundation of some of these business relationships. And many of them now are saying, yep, it's not good, it's impossible to sustain in the long term, we're going to relook at it, and they should. You know, I could keep going. I have 2 or 3 minutes left. I want to conclude with how I started, but I do want to mention one other thing, and that is South China Sea and some of the military. You know, we call China a near peer. Well, that's a ridiculous description. In many ways, they're not peer. We're the near peer. We're trying to catch up to them. And I saw a demonstration, or not a demonstration, but I saw a recording of some of their missile tests and some other things that are, you know, pretty remarkable. Take a hypersonic weapon at that speed and have it do a 270 fishhook. Technologically, that's an incredible advancement. It has real concerns for us, obviously, and we're not there yet. And it's going to take committed for us to get there. I don't think we're at the end of the world. I don't think China is going to take over the world between now and the weekend. It's Tuesday, right? So I mean, they're going to take at least a week. No, look, this is a battle we can win, and we will win. I'm confident that. I really, truly am confident that. I just think the foundation of a constitutional republic always has an enormous advantage over any other form of government. But we will not win if we don't recognize and admit the challenge before us. Now, let me conclude with this. I talked to you about my first meeting with President Xi. Met with him more recently, within the last year or so, and another small group, and I reminded him of our previous conversation and his response. And we kind of talked about that for a little bit. But you know what he said this time? When I asked, do you think that this theorem is true? Is it inevitable that we come in conflict? And before, his answer was, well, no, we don't believe that. We think there's space for both of us. Do you know what his answer was this time? His answer was, we will see. It's a different response. His confidence level is not the same right now as it was 5 years ago. And I think that he views an open lane for him. And we have to close that lane as best we can. Look, I don't want to go to war with China. I have no quarrel with the Chinese people. I want them to have the same opportunities for happiness and self-fulfillment and economic opportunities as I would want for anyone else in the world. But at the same time, I recognize that our governments have a very different view of human rights and the potential for happiness and what it means, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we have to be willing to defend that. Thank you, Frank, for the invitation. Grateful to be with you.
Congressman Stewart has graciously extended his time briefly to take a question or two. Could I get the mic to Ed Timperlake? Another member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China and former Assistant Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you for standing sentry on the rampart. Your committee is essential. Have you seen any indications that the intelligence community has wargamed
a little closer, just
wargamed the consequences of the tremendous OPM data breach that grabbed all of our SF-86s to the tune of 22 million of us, and any thinking along the lines of early warning indicators they've weaponized it, or the consequences of that breach?
It would be impossible for me to answer that question specifically, as you understand and appreciate. So I'm going to answer it broadly and generically, and that is, what does common sense tell us about this? And it's not a difficult thing. They can run through those 23 million names in a heartbeat and connect dots in a heartbeat. And have we seen evidence that they've done that? Absolutely. But you knew that. I mean, how could it not be?
Where would you see it?
Yeah, I'd really rather not. Oh, Well, I mean, I'm just saying you would see that from just your common sense and experience. Derek, keep me out of trouble here. I don't want to get arrested as I walk downstairs. Would you say any more on that, or do you think that's all I can say on that?
I would stay away from that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I'm just saying common sense. You know what they would do with that. So.
Suffice it to say, it ain't good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Peter Husey with Geostrategic Analysis.
From the Air Force Association, do everything you can to keep Hill Air Force Base happy.
Yeah. Yeah.
ICBM base. But I have
Thank
a
you.
question. Your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, what's their pushback on whether China is or is not a threat? What's your most common problem in dealing with it?
So I mean, that's a couple layers to that question. If you talk about my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who work in intelligence or national security, I think that we're of one mind on this. And I think if you look at the hearings that the Intelligence Committee has held in this Congress, some of the open hearings, that gives you an indication because they have dealt with China. And I think that shows you that they believe it's a priority as well. If you talk more broadly about members of the House, I think there's a couple answers to that. One of them is there's some who just don't believe it. And probably there's nothing you could say that would persuade them. And then there's a growing, or not a growing number, but there's a large number who don't care. You know, they got other things on their minds, and this isn't a priority for them. And there's also this thing we have to be very careful to guard against, and that is you can't be perceived as being racist in this. If you are going to criticize the Confucianism centers, you have to be very careful in how you do that, and very thoughtful in how you do that, because we don't want to appear as saying, well, you know, because they're from a different part of the world than we are, and that can't be the, you know, in any way tinge this argument. So there are some who I think are a little hesitant for that reason, and that's unfortunate. But so I know that's not a satisfying answer, but that is the answer. There are some who do, and those in positions of knowledge generally are. But we have a challenge with getting some others engaged in ways that we hope they will be soon. All right.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Frank.
If not,
Again, thank you for the
Bob Fu
opportunity.
would love to stick one in if you've got one more 30 seconds. And then we'll let
Well,
you go.
I'm just filler for Ted Cruz till he gets here
You're the
anyway, so.
One quick question, Congressman.
There's no such thing as a quick question. I've learned that from experience. Everyone always says that. It's not true.
Under the Taiwan Relations Act, of course, somehow somebody set up a protocol that no Taiwan president and vice president would be allowed to even come to this town, Washington, D.C., to give a lecture.
Yeah.
And, you know, Congress has passed the Taiwan Travel Act, supposed to empower or elevate the travel kind of a rank for U.S. U.S. and Taiwan officials exchange. How likely that a Taiwan president or vice president would be allowed under this regime?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think I can give it kind of a relative answer in the sense that, do I think it's likely? I don't know. Do I think it's less likely now than it was before? Probably. Would I bet my house that we'll see that, you know, shortly? Probably not. And but do I think that it would be? Do I think it's important for us to protect that equity, even if it's not exercised, to protect that equity, that this is our policy and we would defend that policy? Absolutely. And by the way, I'm not sure that I would encourage him to right now, to have that formal visit. I do think that, and that's not saying I wouldn't, I'm just saying that if and when we do, it needs to be very thoughtful, because there will be a price that will be paid for that. I mean, heavens, we're dealing with a regime that wants you to rewrite maps, right? And to not show Taiwan as anything other than just a provenance of the mainland. So I just think we would want to be thoughtful, but always keep that possibility as something we would defend. Is that satisfactory? No, it's not, but it's just the truth. Yeah.
If you don't mind filling for just one more minute, he's imminently arriving.
He's in the bathroom? Is that it?
Quite possibly. I'm not sure he's in the building, but I'm told he's moments away. I see George Raisley. I just wanted to follow up on this Taiwan question, if you could, Congressman, without getting into, sorry, am I off? Yes, I am off. Sorry. Without getting into obviously classified assessments. We were talking before you arrived, as you may have seen, about Taiwan and the imminence of the Chinese acting against it. We've known for some time that it's in their plan. It's certainly in the ambition of Xi. But is there not reason to be concerned that the schedule is now being accelerated given what the Chinese have been doing to build capacity to exercise that option?
Okay, I'm gonna have to answer this one really carefully as well, and we'll leave unsatisfied the answer for most of you. To your question, when I said I would do it very thoughtfully, the reason is because of your question. Whoops. Which is obvious. And that is that I think, and I'm going to speak broadly again. Look, it's an obvious question that the intelligence and defense communities have looked at. What do we think their intentions are, and what's the timeline for their intentions? Because you can measure someone's intentions, but the real critical subcategory of that is, do we think it's imminent, or do we think it's a generational problem, and we got some time to deal with it. And so we've looked at this, and as best we can, and as you know, Frank, China is a very, 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 I'm going to say it one more time, very difficult intelligence target. It's one that we have some real deficiencies in, especially on the human side. So we don't know what we don't know, but this is my view, and that is that, again, it's not the thing that I think is going to happen by the weekend. I think we have more time than some people propose. But we don't want to force them to accelerate that, and that's why some of these other considerations are meaningful as well. I see the senator has entered the room, so I'm going to end, but thank you. I was feeling for you, Ted, and on the warm-up band, I'm just hoping that people throw dollars at my feet as I walk out. All right, thank you.
Well, the warm-up act has, I think, got the crowd warmed up. Senator Cruz, we're delighted to have you here. We do have a lavalier, which I know you prefer. It wasn't obvious that it was here until it was thrown off the podium a moment ago. Oh, this is not the lavalier. Excuse me. Hold on to that mic, sir. Senator Ted Cruz is known to everyone in the room, of course. We are extraordinarily pleased that he was able to take a few minutes from an unbelievably packed day. Part of the challenge for us was that tomorrow everybody is going to flee Capitol Hill for the next 2 weeks, and we wanted very much to get this program underway. And so, Senator, I'm grateful to you for making this fit. You know him to be the senator from Texas, the junior senator from Texas, but very much a driving force on Capitol Hill, particularly on matters involving the national security of the United States. Former member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, now a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as the Judiciary Committee, from which he must have just come, where Attorney General Barr is being put through the third degree. Senator, we're glad to have you. Please come forth and speak to us about whatever you'd like to speak about. I think we were told it was going to be academic and military espionage conducted by the Chinese Communist Party, but we're pretty much happy to have you talk on any subject.
Well, Frank, thank you very much. Thank you for your friendship and your leadership. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for addressing the vital national security challenges facing our country. These are perilous times, and I think never more so. We face grave challenges, and yet I'm encouraged that we are rising up and addressing those challenges and addressing them with strength rather than with weakness. Let me talk to you today about China. That's the focus of the discussion here. China is, in my view, and the view of many, the greatest long-term geopolitical risk the United States faces. They are the greatest risk militarily, they are the greatest risk economically, and they are the greatest risk in expanding their world influence and seeking to constrain our own. So how should we deal with that risk? Well, nobody thinks that we can sever ties with China. China is a massive trading partner. China is integrally involved in the economy, our economy and the world economy. But China's interests are not our own. And I believe we need multiple tools to combat the geopolitical and geomilitary threat that we faced. One tool is simply the light of transparency. History teaches us something, that dictatorships fear truth. Tyrannies and dictatorships always appear stronger than they are until they crumble. Why is it that mighty China was so terrified of Tiananmen Square? In my office, the Senate Russell Building, the dominant feature one sees when one walks in is an enormous painting of Ronald Reagan standing before the Brandenburg Gate. And behind him, written above in German in the style of the graffiti, are the words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The backstory, which many people here know, is that 3 times the State Department crossed those words out of the speech. And 3 times President Reagan, with his own hands, wrote them back. And the State Department argued to him, "Mr. President, you don't understand. This sentiment is far too belligerent. It's far too provocative. And Mr. President, come on, let's get serious. This sentiment is unrealistic. It will never, never, never happen. The Soviet Union cannot be defeated, and the Berlin Wall will never come to the ground." And Reagan, with a proverbial twinkle in his eye, said, "You don't understand. This is the whole point of the speech." And just a couple of years later, the Berlin Wall was torn to the ground without a single shot being fired. That's the power of truth. So how does that impact communist oppression? Because they cannot stand those words, communist oppression. The apologists for the Chinese communists that we have in the media, that we have sadly in Congress, are not advancing the cause of peace, or not advancing the cause of human rights. They're not advancing the cause of truth by hiding the truth. Several years ago, I introduced into law legislation that would rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Plaza, named after the Nobel Peace Laureate who was wrongfully imprisoned. Now, that's actually a strategy that I took unapologetically from Reagan, because Reagan had named the street in front of the Soviet embassy Sakharov Plaza. On exactly the same theory. You think about it, actually, that in terms of shining a light, every letter the Soviet communists had to write to their embassy, they had to write Sakharov Plaza if they wanted it to get there. In today's world, on the website, if you want to tell people how to get to the embassy, you got to put the address. So that legislation, when I introduced it, there were a series of times I rose and asked unanimous consent to pass it in the Senate. And there was a series of times that Senator Feinstein stood up and objected. And she and I debated vigorously on the Senate floor. Well, one of the things one learns in Washington is there are various levers of influence and power. And so, one of the tools that I had at my disposal that I used is I placed a hold on every State Department nominee. Said, we're done confirming State Department nominees until this gets through. Well, that dismayed a lot of people. And I said, listen, I'm perfectly willing to be reasonable. I'm perfectly willing to cut a deal, pass my legislation, and I'll lift the hold. They came back and said, well, how about we just pass a resolution? I said, that's an interesting idea. Let me repeat the deal again. Pass my legislation, and I'll lift the hold. Well, at the end of the day, what did the Senate do? It passed my legislation, and I lifted the hold. Now, that ended up not passing in the House. It was sadly blocked by a House Republican, I might note. But it was blocked in the House, and so it didn't pass into law. So if you go to the Chinese embassy today, it is not located on Liu Xiaobo Plaza. But I'll tell you something very interesting. Fast forward to the Trump administration. The Chinese government, when they laid out their top priorities, right at the top of the list is preventing that cruise legislation from passing into law. I remember having breakfast with Rex Tillerson at the State Department. He was shaking his head. He couldn't understand it, but for whatever reason, China, when they were talking to him, front and center is do not let that legislation pass. Now, at the time, Liu Xiaobo had passed. But his widow, Liu Xia, was still in China, was prevented from leaving China, was prevented from going and getting the proceeds of the Nobel Peace Prize that he had won. And so I told Rex very simply, I said, all right, I'll tell you what. Tell China to let Liu Xia go. If you let her go, I'll relent and stop pushing the legislation. But if they don't let her go, they'll see me continue to push it, and I'll point out I passed it once. And I have many faults, but lack of tenaciousness is not one of them. Well, I can tell you after considerable pressure, both public and private, China finally relented and released Liu Xia. Now look, at some level people might say, oh, come on, we're talking about a street sign. No, we're not. We're talking about shining a light into darkness. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with Natan Sharansky, the famed Soviet dissident. He and I visited in Jerusalem. He described to me how in the Gulag, they would pass from cell to cell notes. Did you hear what President Reagan said? Evil empire, ash heap of history. Tear down this wall. You come to my office, there is a silk painting of me that was given to my office, that was made by dissidents in North Korea who had smuggled it out. Now, I've never been to North Korea. When each of you are speaking, you may not think your voice is penetrating beyond the Beltway. But just as with the Soviet Gulag, shining a light on evil and oppression is heard in the very darkest of hellholes. And tyrannies fear that. Speaking out, highlighting, speaking out about the Uyghurs, the persecution, the religious persecution, speaking out about Tibet, shining a light is powerful. The second thing we need to do is we need to take these threats deadly seriously. It's why I'm so grateful that we are in the midst of the biggest military rebuild since Ronald Reagan. Part of the reason China is... Part of the reason China is so formidable is that they are investing billions in building up their military forces. And after 8 years of the Obama administration of weakening our ability to defend ourselves, it is critical that we are, in fact, turning that around. And that includes not just jets, not just ships, both of which are desperately needed. But that also includes the next domain, which is space. The threat in space is profound. Our vulnerability in space is profound. The Chinese are investing billions in offensive weaponry in space. For years on the Senate Armed Services Committee, when generals or admirals would come before me, I would ask over and over again, I'd say, tell me, how many times are you practicing military exercises in a space-down environment? It's all fine and good to have a fifth-generation fighter aircraft. But do you know how to land it if GPS goes down? Do you know how to hit your enemy without all of this wonderful technology? Our aircraft carriers are mighty sailing cities that depend intimately on the satellite data they are receiving moment by moment. We need to be investing far more vigorously in defending space. That's an area that I have led the charge for the last 7 years. One of the things I'm most proud of on the Senate Armed Services Committee is passing into law for the first time legislation as part of the National Defense Authorization Act directing the Department of Defense to develop and implement a missile defense test bed for space-based missile interceptors. And critically, the important thing about space-based, so our missile interceptors right now can intercept a missile as it re-enters the atmosphere. The problem is it is moving unbelievably fast. It may have broken into multiple warheads and countermeasures will be deployed. The beauty of a space-based missile interceptor is you can intercept at boost phase. When the missile's just taking off, when it's traveling slowly, when it hasn't broken into multiple warheads, when it can't deploy countermeasures. That investment is critically important. Let me say the third piece that I think is tremendously important for China. And that is safeguarding ourselves at home. China is not our friend. They invest billions in espionage and theft. The Senate Armed Services Committee, I passed into law legislation giving the Defense Department the ability to veto universities allowing Confucius institutions onto their campuses. Confucius institutes far too often has served as bases for active and aggressive espionage. And we need to understand that China is perfectly willing to invest money. We see it across the globe with the One Belt, One Road initiative, where they're investing billions on expanding their influence. Well, the same is true here in the United States, where they're investing billions in influence campaigns and in espionage and theft. I'll tell you, I've had multiple meetings with a major research institution in Texas that describes how they have on their research staff multiple Chinese nationals who are researchers, who are employees of theirs. But they also happen to be on the payroll of the Chinese government. And the Chinese government is in many instances paying them 2, 3, 4 times as much as their ostensible employer. Well, what they started discovering is that they were working on research, cutting-edge research, that they had not yet filed for U.S. patents on. And suddenly their research, they would discover China, a Chinese company filing for a U.S. patent on the identical research. And this is not a military and defense researcher. The extent to which China is investing actively in espionage. You look at Huawei and telecom and intercepting and spying, Confucius institutes. We need to guard ourselves at home. So those are the 3 things I would encourage you. Number 1, shine a light and speak the truth. Number 2, defend ourselves and be prepared to defend ourselves. And number 3, guard ourselves at home. And the end of this, let me encourage you, I believe will be the same as the end of those words, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Truth is stronger than lies, and light is stronger than darkness. So thank you for taking these threats seriously.
Senator Cruz, thank you so much. Extraordinarily thoughtful and inspiring words on precisely what brings us together as a committee on the present danger. We look forward to working with you, sir, and to your team in the Senate. I believe that the Speaker of the House, unfortunately not the current Speaker of the House, is in the House. You all know, of course, Newt Gingrich. He has come to address this because this existential threat to freedom is, I know, on top of his mind. And he has been doing, through both his sort of public ministries on Fox and in many other outlets, and of course through his contacts with the President of the United States and other leaders of our country, his level best to raise awareness of this problem of the present danger with China, the Chinese Communist Party, and I'm absolutely thrilled that he's been able to find a very few minutes to join us to talk about some of those concerns here today. Speaker Gingrich, I know you've got a hard stop right about the top of the hour, so we're going to ask you to come, shoot, and scoot, as they say. Welcome.
Well, let me just say, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to have Frank's continuing leadership on national security issues, and I think this is a very important initiative in that direction. I'm just going to say 3 or 4 quick things and then maybe take a couple questions. Let me start by saying that I think that the first thing I want to emphasize is that Xi Jinping is the chairman of the Military Commission, the Secretary General of the Communist Party, and the President of the People's Republic of China. And if you remember that it's in that order. The Military Commission gives him control of the People's Liberation Army, which is explicitly a wing of the party, not the government. The role of Secretary General gives him 89 million members. By contrast, Trump got 63 million votes. So he has a cadre across the whole country of 89 million people. And the number one duty of the Chinese system is the preservation of the party. And anybody who doesn't understand that completely misunderstands what's going on. And third, as long as you remember that he has the military and the party, he's also the president of the country. Now, all of our Western media and our diplomats tend to think of him as president, which puts him in the context of a Western traditional system, which he's not. So that's just my first observation. My second observation is that everybody who really wants to understand this, and I frankly got this from Kissinger's book on China, and I've since been following it up, and I really believe it's true. Everybody who would really like to understand this should learn how to play Go. The difference between Go and chess is so radical, and Go is so much more reflective of Chinese styles of warfare, and so much reflects the period of the Warring States and the period before that, that it's really worth your looking at, and then it's worth your, after you get in the rhythm of Go, going back and rereading Sun Tzu and realizing how dramatically different it is from Clausewitz. The Western world with chess basically has an offensive system of taking pieces, and our military, for example, tends to think very heavily in kinetic terms of fighting battles and winning wars. What Go teaches you, and what Sun Tzu and much of the writing of the ancient period teaches you, is that victory is actually the goal. And as Sun Tzu says, the greatest of all generals win bloodless victories. Fighting's not the goal. Victory is. So if you apply the pattern of Go, and if you apply the principles of Sun Tzu, there are 3 case studies right now, and we're losing all 3, which are very useful models to look at. And my newsletter, which will come out tomorrow, suggests that the insanity of the American news media is a major part of our current problem, because you can look at their coverage of things that are utterly silly, and then look at the absence of their coverage of things that may be life and death. So I'll just give you 3 examples of grand strategic effort that make perfect sense under the Chinese model. The first is the South China Sea, which begins in the 1930s when the Kuomintang issues the 9-dash line, which in essence sets the precedent for claiming that virtually all of the South China Sea is Chinese territory, which would thereby vitiate the whole concept of the international law of the sea, because it's now arguing this is not an international sea anymore. This is a Chinese sea. Now, they followed up on that, and then this is a long Chinese tradition. I mean, there's a lot of parallel between the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists. They were both trained by the Soviets. The Whampoa University for Chiang Kai-shek was literally staffed originally by the Soviets. They both believed in a Leninist model of centralized party hierarchy. And so in a lot of ways, beyond fighting a civil war, they were actually the same gang fighting a civil war because they wanted power. But they were not nearly as different as our news coverage would have had you believe. In that setting, the Chinese came in and said, you know, we're going to build a few islands, but they're all peaceful. Oh, and we may put airfields on them, but they'll be peaceful. Oh, and we might put a port there, but it'll be peaceful. Oh, well, we have to put in some anti-aircraft systems because we don't trust you. But they're peaceful anti-aircraft systems. And we may bring an occasional ship in to prove that we can take care of ourselves, but that's because of you. After all, you should be over in San Diego or somewhere, but you insist on being over here. And so what they've done is they've gradually begun to establish facts, all of which are invidious to our interest. Second example, the entire Bridge and Road Initiative. As many of you know, my wife is currently the ambassador to the Vatican. So we get to live in Rome. And it's a brutal assignment, but as a citizen, I'm prepared to help. I'm trying to be supportive of Callista in serving the country. But recently, Xi Jinping came to Italy and signed a contract to run Genoa, which is the largest port in Italy, and a contract to run Trieste, which is the port which opens up the space to go to Austria and southern Germany. Now, in the Cold War, if the Soviets had opened up 2 ports in Italy, we would all have understood this was catastrophic. Now you can't even get it covered because we have some guy in Chicago who pays people to beat him up so he can claim that it's an anti-Trump event. And we have in the article I did tomorrow, the number of minutes the news media devoted to this insanity was unbelievable. But it fits the infantile nature of the current news media. So people don't even realize in this country that what you're watching is a gradual rolling offensive of enormous sophistication. They also, by the way, have a contract to run the port of Piraeus in Greece. So and the reason Trieste matters is it takes 1 week off of delivering Chinese freight to South Germany. So you're watching a revolution in strategic economic capabilities and a revolution in geographic location of power. And all of it's being done while we sleepwalk. The third example, which I've been deeply involved in, is 5G and Huawei. We are literally crazy in dealing with this. 5G matters because, as Samsung has a great sign that says 5G, 5th generation, is to 4G as a computer is to a typewriter. It takes 6 to 7 minutes to download a movie in 4G. It takes 3 seconds in 5G. It is the key to rural America getting broadband. It makes possible everything from autonomous vehicles to distance surgery. It will be central to the battlefield of the future. Our companies are so out of sync. I mean, take AT&T, which is currently lying about this whole thing. And the reason they're lying is simple. They took $85 billion and they bought Time Warner. For $85 billion, they could have leapfrogged Huawei and we'd be the dominant internet country in the world. But now that they're the most indebted American corporation, they can't afford to go to 5G. And they're desperate that nobody else go to 5G. And I've been on, for the last 4 months, I've been in a knockdown, drag-out fight in the White House and in the Defense Department. To go to 5G in America, you have to have an amount of capability from the Defense Department. There's no other place that has enough. And we have bureaucrats in the Defense Department who, for the last 4 months, have dug their heels in. And so what you get is the domestic companies will tell you, well, we're not doing badly here. Well, first of all, we've blocked Huawei from being here. But they missed the whole point. Huawei's now in 60 or 70 countries. Now, how are you going to operate worldwide if virtually every country in the world has a Chinese internet system? And we are truly, totally out of sync with reality. So I came here, I have a very simple model. We are right now, if you draw the comparison with the Cold War, we are right now in the period just before Kennan wrote the long telegram. We haven't had a wake-up call. We don't understand what the problem is. We don't understand what the scale of the response is going to have to be. And we are losing. And anybody who tells you we are not losing is simply misinformed. And this is an enormous problem. This is going to be a long-term struggle between a civilization that believes in liberty and a civilization that believes in authoritarianism with Chinese characteristics. And these are civilizational fights. These aren't countries. And we currently have no political basis for thinking through and understanding what we're doing. So that's what I'm up to. That's why I wanted to go out of the way and come by for a little bit.
Thank you, Newt.
Can I give you 10 minutes?
We'll take some questions.
Can I take 10 minutes?
Speaker, thank you for that extraordinary wake-up call and the willingness to take some questions. Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. Let me get a mic
Hold
to you,
on.
Peter, please. Right here, next to you, next to you. There you go.
Well, I don't have a question, Speaker Gingrich, but I wanted to congratulate you for on 26 March, President Trump signing the executive order to protect our nation from electromagnetic pulse. You know, this is a personal victory. Your vision and leadership, when there was almost no one speaking about this, you were the one of the few political leaders who brought this to national attention, including being the first person in a presidential debate when you were running for president to raise this issue, for which the New York Times, tried to, and headlines tried to mock you and all the rest. But your vision and courage finally made this happen. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for listening to the scientists and strategists who for 20 years have been trying to make this happen. It wouldn't have happened without you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to respond?
No,
Peter
I
Houston.
said thank you. What else can? When a guy's that positive, don't mess it up.
Don't get in the way.
Mr. Speaker, Peter Husey from the
Yeah.
Air Force Association. Roger Robinson, former chairman, as you know, the Congressional China Commission, says there's 700 Chinese companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange.
Right.
Very few of them have done the due diligence required to say who owns you, who owns your stock, what are you up to. There is an SEC office, that's meant to say, hey, you don't get listed unless you do this. Would you please help?
Yes.
Get these, because
I talked
they're
to
raising the cash to use to modernize their military.
I talked to Roger yesterday afternoon. Yes.
Super.
And that, by the way, is one of the 70 or 80 or 90 things we need to be doing. But it's a good example.
Chris Hall, also a member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to be able to speak with you again. My name is Christopher Hall. I'm with the Epoch Times, writing a piece on this. I was wondering if you could address, at the same time that we are trying to wake up the country to the threat of communist China, we have as a Democratic frontrunner a self-acclaimed socialist who spent the Cold War apparently singing the national anthem of the USSR in Moscow, and we have in Congress an open socialist who is advocating something that looks very much like the Great Leap Forward in China's history, which starved untold millions of people to death. Could you address any links that you see between the fight with China and the fight with that same ideology here in the United States?
Sure. I mean, my view, my view is that Ronald Reagan defeated communism in Moscow but lost to it at Stanford. It's that simple. I mean, you have an academic left that pervades the whole system. You have reporters who grow out of the academic left who pervade the whole system. You've had 3 generations now of teaching people lies. And so you have the natural result. And the only long-term healthy answer in a free society is you got to go beat them. You have to turn. I believe there's a chance that next year will resemble 1972 because these people verge on being crazy. And I think the average American's not crazy. They may at times be sort of passive and let people babble for a while, but in the end they have a tendency not to vote for self-immolation.
Thank God. Rick Fisher.
Rick Fisher with the
Also
International
member of
Assessment
our
and
committee.
Strategy Center. Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Speaker. When the Chinese want to organize for victory, especially long-term victory, Taiwan against the United States, for example, they organize something called a leading group that brings together all the stakeholders across their government, intelligence, military system, and they all talk to each other and they go forward. Is there a lesson in that for the United States? Is it time for us to consider that we're not at all organized for this coming present conflict?
Sure. And I actually had coffee with about a dozen U.S. senators this morning, and that topic came up because neither the House nor the Senate is organized. I mean, if you take the example of Huawei and 5G, it probably covers 7 or 8 different major government agencies. It covers probably 3 or 4 Senate and House committees. So there's no natural center of energy and center of knowledge to organize. And I think very much as we had to get organized in the 30s to stop un-American activities, which people tend to forget originally was an anti-Nazi committee, or as we had to get organized in terms of creating the CIA, the Strategic Air Command, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We're going to go through the same cycle here. I think my only point as a historian is we're in phase 1 where we have to have a big argument, and this will be part of the 2020 election. Do you think China is a threat or not? Do you think the United States should, in fact, decide that it does not want a Chinese internet dominating the planet or not? And you really want to have NATO partners, just as we have Chancellor Merkel selling out to Putin on natural gas. We now have the Italians selling out to Xi Jinping on running ports. At what point do we need to develop a more robust diplomacy and a more robust foreign policy that takes them head on? 1 or 2 more questions.
I think you're getting the cane. If you're willing to take 1 or 2 more, we've got 1 or 2 more to give you.
Okay.
Sasha Gong, also a member of our committee.
I'm a big fan of Rendezvous with History.
Oh, thank you.
Here's what, I wonder if you can talk to the White House. I came from China, and I was a political prisoner there in the 70s. The main difference between the China threat now and the Soviet threat at that time was, at that time, the United States and the free world want the people in China, in the Eastern Bloc, in Soviet Union, want their mind and heart. And I remember so vividly in the 1980s, the United States was an icon. Nowadays, what happens is that you saw China try very hard and quite successful to want the mind and heart of people in the free world. And just look at schools, how many professors thought China was a better country. So what do you think the United States should do?
Well, I think, first of all, Diana West wrote a great book on American betrayal, and if you go back and you look, remember, in the 30s, we had to defeat Nazi sympathizers. In the 40s and 50s, we had to defeat Soviet sympathizers. I mean, Reagan becomes an active anti-communist after a Screen Actors Guild meeting when he goes out and has a drink with a friend of his who's a genuine communist who says, not only am I a Stalinist, but if we take over, we're either going to lock you up or kill you. And Reagan goes home that night and thinks, this guy's really sincere. Okay? I mean, but that's how these things occur. So we're going to have to go back through another round. I mean, I just remind everybody, if you think these are nice people, look at the Uyghurs. I asked a Chinese leader to explain to me their million-person concentration camps of Uyghurs, and he said, well, think of them better as schools that room and board. They're not really concentration camps. We're trying to help them learn Chinese. I mean, now, a person who can say that with a straight face is a genuinely dangerous person. I am going to have to run. I'm getting yelled at over here. It's quiet yelling, but I can feel it. Let me just say, I think, Frank, what you and your team are doing is vital. I think free societies have to educate themselves, have to think through the response, have to aggressively implement. I am tactically very, very worried, but strategically, having survived Wilhelmine Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union, I'm reasonably confident that in the very long run, we will have a greater capacity to respond than will any totalitarian dictatorship, even one with a 5,000-year history. Thank you all very, very much.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. You've not only made Diana West's day, who is here with us, I'm happy to say, the author, by the way, in addition to American Betrayal, of a brand new book called The Red Thread, which is a fascinating read on what has motivated the anti-Trump conspiracy of recent days. You've also, Mr. Speaker, teed up perfectly our next speaker, and we're a little bit behind schedule, but I know we'll make it up. His name is Salih Haidar. He is the political officer of the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement, a movement that has been pulled together to try to call attention to and remedy what is now being done by the Chinese as part of their war on faith to the Uyghur population of East Turkestan. We're very pleased to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us. Come on up.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Frank Gaffney and the rest of the committee for having me. My name is Salih Haidar. I am an Uyghur and I am an American. I was born in China-occupied East Turkestan, a land that some of you might know as Xinjiang. In 1949, our independent Republic of East Turkestan was invaded by Chinese Communist forces. Our sovereign government was overthrown, and the Chinese Communist Party began a brutal campaign to assert their control over our homeland. They renamed our homeland to Xinjiang. It literally means the new territory. But to this day, the Uyghurs and other native peoples of East Turkestan don't call it that. We call it East Turkestan. And we would ask that you call it East Turkestan too. My story begins when I was just a child. When I was 4 years old, my uncle was arrested. His crime, he had been reading a religious book. Eager to find out where my uncle got the banned book, the police raided our home in the middle of the night. The Chinese Communist authorities grabbed me and told my family that they would kill me unless they told them what they wanted to hear. Desperate to save my 4-year-old life, my family told the communist authorities everything that they wanted to hear. As a result, most of the adult males in my family were arrested. Today, I have over 100 relatives, including my immediate and extended family, who are imprisoned in China's vast systems of prisons, concentration camps, and Bingtuan labor camps. Every time I speak out, the Chinese Communist Party's occupation forces target my family. And I'm sure that they'll be watching today's event live streamed and will only continue to target my family more. But that will not silence me. With every family member they arrest, torture, or kill, my resolve to advocate for East Turkestan's independence only solidifies. I will not kowtow and I will not bow. When I was 7 years old, my family was finally able to afford to flee our homeland, and we came to America. We settled in Oklahoma, and here in the land of the free and the home of the brave, we felt welcomed. I joined the United States Army with the hopes of becoming a military officer in order to show my gratitude to the nation that gave my family hope. Unfortunately, my military career was cut short, and I was honorably discharged due to a kidney condition. I love America, and America is my home. Since I left East Turkestan, China's campaign of terror against the people of East Turkestan has only intensified. This is a war on ethnically Turkic people. This is a war on religion. And most of all, this is a war on the idea, the idea of a free and independent East Turkestan. The oppression of religion is what I want to talk about today. And first off, to be clear of the misconceptions, China's war on religion is not only exclusive to the Uyghurs or other Muslims. In fact, Christians are being profoundly affected too. And so too are Buddhists and practitioners of Falun Gong and even religious adherents of like Judaism, Hinduism, and Taoism. And they too are suffering under this brutal campaign. Today, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination estimates that upwards of 3 million innocent souls are being held in so-called re-education camps or vocational training centers. And these are sick euphemisms for what is in reality concentration camps. Mosques, churches, and temples are being destroyed. Facial recognition cameras are being deployed around the religious buildings. Muslim imams, Christian pastors, and Buddhist monks are being surveilled and arrested. Faithful Muslims are being forced to eat pork and drink alcohol. And China isn't just targeting the faithful, it's targeting their leaders too. Through coercion, intimidation, bribery, disinformation, or some combination of the four, China has managed to win the silence of Pope Francis and Saudi King bin Salman. The faithful in China and the region it occupies, like East Turkestan and Tibet, are left without defenders. China's war on religion, war on Turkic peoples, war on the idea of an independent East Turkestan isn't limited on male adults. Vulnerable women and children are being targeted too, even the unborn. East Turkestani women are being forced to marry ethnically Han, atheist, communist Chinese men. Expectant Uyghur mothers are being forced to undergo abortions in order to comply with China's arbitrary population control policies. In the camps, women and men are being sterilized. Children are being separated from their families and being placed in state-run orphanages. Even in my own family, I have many of my youngest relatives that are missing and possibly in these orphanages or boarding schools, as they call it. For the Chinese Communist Party, communism is a religion in and of itself. They seek to place the state higher than all and any power. History shows that totalitarian, genocidal regimes often do this. Look at Nazi Germany, look at the Soviet Union. The Uyghurs and the people of East Turkestan are only the latest victims of communism. At any moment, China may decide to shift from slowly starving us in the concentration camps to actively exterminating us. Without meaningful international action, the people of East Turkestan may be facing a Holocaust. What we need today is for America to resurrect the lessons of the Cold War and to know that America is in existential battle with a rising totalitarian hegemon. We need to stop trade negotiations with the religion-hating, human rights abusing regime in Beijing, and instead we need to impose punishing trade tariffs and human rights sanctions. American consumers should be rallied to boycott made-in-China goods, especially those that are made with forced labor. American banks and institutional investors should lead an effort to divest from Chinese stocks, especially the stocks of companies who are knowingly enabling China's human rights atrocities. For our part, our organization, the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement, is leading the nonviolent effort to advocate for restoring East Turkestani independence, and we won't stop. It is vital that America recognize the clear and present danger that China poses to all free people, marshaling all available resources to wage a whole front of government effort to undermine the Chinese Communist Party and to support the aspirations of peaceful, pro-independence and pro-democracy activists in occupied East Turkestan, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Southern Mongolia, Manchuria, and elsewhere. I'm here to tell you that the people of East Turkestan support independence. The people of East Turkestan support America, and the people of East Turkestan hope that America will support us too. Thank you, and God bless you.
Sally, thank you not only for that very powerful expression of the problem that your own people are facing, but making the point that this is indeed a war on faith by the Chinese Communist Party more generally. You've, in a way, teed up with your comments about the trade deal. Our next presenter, Gordon Chang, is, of course, well known to everyone in this room and everyone who follows China. He is one of the country's foremost, I think, public figures in terms of describing the challenges that we're addressing with this Committee on the Present Danger. He does it through myriad media outlets, radio and television, through his writings at the Daily Beast. He is also, of course, the author of several important books, including The Coming Collapse of China. I'm very privileged to say he's also a weekly guest on our radio program, Secure Freedom Radio, and we're delighted to have him here with us today to talk a little bit about trade and the context in which we are discussing it today against the present danger. Gordon Chang, welcome.
The Committee on the Present Danger, China, is a critical element of the defense against the greatest threat to free societies everywhere. It is an honor for me to be here today. Thank you so much, Frank. Just about everything is on the line in our trade talks with China. This is where we determine our future, not just this decade, but in subsequent periods. Yes, it is that significant because we have an opportunity to not rescue Chinese communism. We've done that so many times in the past, starting with President Nixon. Actually, Nixon had a good reason to rescue China's communists because that was a low point for us in the Cold War. But we also saved China after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. We shouldn't have done it then, and we shouldn't do it now. We shouldn't do it now because Xi Jinping, I think the greatest danger to us and to other societies, is at a weak point. He needs a lifeline. He needs a lifeline because his economy is weak. The official National Bureau of Statistics says that China's economy grew 6.6% last year, but that's far too high. A professor at Renmin University in Beijing created a sensation across China in December when he said in 2018, China will grow no more than 1.67%, and it may actually be contracting. And that sounds just about right. Well, we know in March, after 3 months of evident contraction, the Chinese economy picked up a little bit. It picked up a little bit because Chinese leaders said that they were going to do something that they said they would never do, which is to flood the economy with debt. Flooding the economy with debt is not sustainable. There is only one sustainable escape path for the Chinese Communist Party, and that is a trade deal with the United States. So I say we should not sign a deal with China, and today I'll talk about 5 reasons for not doing so. First, China just has not honored trade deals with the United States for decades. So who thinks here that the remedy for failed decades of trade agreements with China is to sign up another one? Second of all, China does not believe in the notion of comparative advantage, which underpins global trade. So there's really nothing to talk to Xi Jinping about. Third, a trade deal will try to open up China. In other words, to reform China. But even if it were in our interest to reform China, and that is not one of our goals, it is simply not possible to do that with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, for about a half-decade, has been reversing reform in China because he believes in a state economy. And that's clear because we know about his Made in China 2025 program. Xi Jinping simply does not share our goals when it comes to trade or anything else. And that means we can't accomplish anything with an agreement. Fourth, Xi Jinping just does not believe in the legitimacy of the Westphalian international system. For more than a decade, he's been dropping hints that China is the world's only sovereign state. In September 2017, his foreign minister said that Xi Jinping's thoughts on diplomacy make innovations on and transcend 300 years of Western international relations thinking. You take September 2017, you subtract 300 years, you get to the Treaty of Westphalia, which is the foundation of today's international system of competing sovereign states. So, my question is, what's the point of helping somebody who believes in these things, that China is the world's only ruler? Fifth, China is using the profits of our trade to expand its military, whose officers openly talk about and gleefully talk about killing Americans. Twice in December, senior officers of the People's Liberation Army openly advocated unprovoked attacks on the U.S. Navy in the global commons. In the second of those bellicose statements, on the 20th of that month, a Chinese rear admiral said that China should use its DF-21D missiles and its DF-26 missiles to kill 10,000 Americans by sinking 2 aircraft carriers. Now, these statements are not reflective of official thinking in Beijing, but they are reflective of what senior leaders of the People's Liberation Army want. So why should we help this rear admiral accomplish his goals? And remember, the Chinese have gone beyond just boasting about this in public. In May, we learned that the Chinese, from their military base in Djibouti, lasered our C-130, temporarily blinding 2 of the pilots. You blind the pilot of a plane, you intend to bring it down. If you intend to bring it down, you intend to kill the crew. We also know that this spring, that Beijing caused brain injuries to our diplomats in the consulate in Guangzhou. So we have to ask ourselves, why should we maintain trade or cordial relationships with a country that intends to harm us? So what should we do on trade? Well, I think that President Trump needs to undo the reprieve of the higher tariffs that he granted the Chinese in February. I think we need to increase the tariffs beyond those already scheduled rates. And I believe that we need to ban the importation into the United States of goods that have benefited from the theft of U.S. intellectual property. And we should also ban the importation of goods sold by companies that have stolen U.S. IP. We should do these things until Beijing stops stealing our intellectual property and stops committing trade violations. Now, not many people think that this will happen, but we've got to remember that we have leverage over the Chinese. We have a healthy economy, the Chinese do not. We have a larger economy than China's, and our economy in reality is growing faster than theirs. And we have an economy that is not dependent on trade. The overriding reality is that the Chinese are critically reliant on the U.S. market. Beijing statistics, which normally understates China's exports to the U.S. because they don't count transshipments through Hong Kong. They show that in 2018, China's merchandise trade surplus with the United States accounted for 91.9% of China's overall merchandise trade surplus. 91.9%. Now, most everyone believes that you can't separate the U.S. and the Chinese economies. And indeed, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang
in his March 15th once-a-year press conference, actually came out and said, it is not feasible or possible to separate China and the United States. Well, if the Chinese premier said that, he's obviously worried about it. He is concerned about this discoupling of the two economies, this disengagement, because people understand that our tactics and our strategies in the past to try to engage China have just completely failed, and that we should try something new. Will disengagement hurt us? Yeah, of course it will. But people forget that we're already suffering a grievous wound. Each year, China steals U.S. intellectual property to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. Some people say as little as $150 billion. Some people say $600 billion. But the amount is a grievous wound to the United States. It is consequential. After all, we have an innovation-based economy, and if we cannot commercialize our innovation, we do not have an economy of the future, and we do not then have a society of the future. So yes, disengagement will hurt, but it is necessary. But we cannot expect that the remedy for decades of misguided U.S. trade policy is going to be without cost. We have to disengage. We have to disengage now. And for God's sakes, let's not save the Chinese economy and the Chinese political system again. Thank you.
Sully, do you want to come on up? We're just going to have a few minutes of discussion, folks. I understand our next speaker is here, but we're just going to try to make sure that we have some interaction with you all. Are there any questions or comments? Chad? Chad, formerly with the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
And now I'm retired for the third time.
Retired for the third time.
For Gordon,
It's on.
okay. The reticence to enforce the sanctions is something that, we all saw. Who do you think, and do you think that there's support for the kinds of process that you're advocating in the administration? And if so, when do you think you'll start we may see evidence that they're following a path similar to what you're advocating?
Well, I think that certainly Peter Navarro advocates a robust policy towards China. I think even U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, in creating requirements that the Chinese cannot fulfill, is moving along this path. A number of people have said that the administration is really looking towards the disengagement of the U.S. and the Chinese economies. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think what's happening is that the American people demand a certain type of trade agreement. The Chinese cannot agree to it. And if they agree to it, they can't honor it. So we're moving in this direction anyway. We've seen a number of companies have said that they are trying to get parts of their supply chain out of China. This is going to occur, Chad. It's very important for us. And it's going to be essentially the American people who support this, regardless of who's in the administration.
Any other comments or questions? Faith McDonald. Faith is one of the great faith leaders in this country, as a matter of fact, and defenders of faith worldwide. Welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you both. And as a faith leader, you would think I would have a question for Sally, but I just spent quite a bit of time with him. So my question is actually for you, Gordon. China is swallowing up Africa right now. I'm very concerned about China's role and influence in Africa in many countries, and what can we do to convince U.S. businesses that they should be competitive with China in Africa? They should be pushing. They shouldn't be afraid of Africa. They should go in and get things done.
That's a great question, and it's not only Africa, it's also in the regions closer to home, Latin America and the Caribbean. No administration can tell companies what to do. And that's very much the difference between our system and China's, where China just tells the state enterprises to go out and do certain things, which is the reason why over the last 15, 20 years, you've seen rapid Chinese penetration of the African market, as well as South America. We've got a problem right now in Venezuela, in part because of China, but also the Caribbean, where essentially Chinese companies are making investments that have little commercial rationale. For us, it's going to have to really be making sure a couple things. One of them is that when borrowers of easy Chinese cash get into trouble, that the IMF and other multilateral institutions don't rescue them. And this is the issue right now with Pakistan, because Pakistan's borrowed something like on the order of $62 billion, and finding it very difficult to pay back the Chinese. But also I think that what we're going to have to do ultimately is we're just going to have to oppose the Chinese at each and every step of the way. It's going to be difficult for us. There are a lot of little things that we can do, but there's no one big thing. Not until we change our economic system where we can tell AT&T and General Motors and everybody else to go out and do something that's good for U.S. national security. I think ultimately, though, we will respond because if you look at, for instance, your case of Africa, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies each and every year come from sub-Saharan African, and eventually American companies will see the light. But you've got to remember, even with all this talk about China taking over Africa, the biggest foreign investor by stock is the United States.
Could I just add a point? I truthfully haven't had a chance to read this myself, but the author of the piece that appeared in the Wall Street Journal this morning was in the room earlier today. I don't see him at the moment. But he described, as I recall, an effort now being made on an interagency basis by the United States government together with private sector entities to try to go into some of these countries, and I think do very much what you're talking about, Gordon, to help raise the alarm about the debt trap. I think of them as sort of payday loan kind of approach that is ensnaring country after country and creating, as you say, Faith, this condition that ultimately leads to domination to the great detriment of the people and governments involved. Anybody else want to make a quick comment? Sasha Gong?
Yeah, actually, my question is that I once heard someone working for Deng Xiaoping told me one thing, is that, well, in the early 1990s when the United States was talking about sanction, and Deng Xiaoping said, well, they want to deal with 300 million refugees, let them do. That's the very fundamental threat from China. And I heard also from the Chinese economists that 70% of Chinese economy at this time somewhat depends on foreign trade. So your disengagement policy, have you ever thought how do we deal with that aspect?
One of the most effective things we can do with China without firing a shot is to encourage Chinese people to leave with their money. That's unfortunately not up to us because of the draconian capital controls in China. And we've got a very difficult determination of figuring out who's who. But I think it's important for us to make sure that companies and individuals can take their cash out of China. And there's a number of things that it's very hard for us in terms of that determination, but we can avoid creating obstacles to it. Because the one thing that China's worried about right now is not keeping their currency low, but it's keeping it high in order to convince Chinese to keep their money in country. There was $1.0 trillion of net capital outflow in 2015, probably about $1.1 trillion in 2016 until the Chinese stopped it. This is a critical vulnerability for them.
Go ahead, yes, sir.
Thank you. Robert Delaney from the South China Morning Post. My question is for you, Frank. Just wanted to know specifically what are the next steps that the committee is going to take in order to realize your main objectives? What specific steps are we going to see? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm going to defer that to my colleague Brian Kennedy, who is going to close us with some comments on that, but I'll be happy to talk to you offline afterwards as well. I did want to just say, Salih, and thank you to Kyle as well. Kyle Obed is part of this East Turkestan National Awakening movement. Would you just say a word or two about the coalition that has been recently launched, of which you all are important parts, under the banner of the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, to help demonstrate the solidarity of people of various faiths in this country in particular, but increasingly around the world over what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to wage war against, as you said earlier, all faiths.
Yes. Firstly, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. Firstly, I'd like to thank Ambassador Brownback for leading this IRF coalition, for bringing the various interfaith groups, both inside China and its occupied territories, and then all across the world, to face the challenge that China is posing to religious freedom, not just in East Turkestan or not just in China, but all across the world, because China is promoting its totalitarian form of governance, or with Chinese characteristics, and using its economic and political leverage to in essence eradicate religious freedom all across the world. You can see this happening in Central Asia, where they are trying to silence people who are raising the atrocities that China is doing, like Serikchan Bilash and others. So I want to thank this committee and the present danger, the Committee on the Present Danger, and the IRF Roundtable for highlighting religious freedom, because religious freedom is one of the key components that China is targeting. Because China, it sees itself, the Chinese Communist Party sees itself more than it's as the overall power, more than God. It doesn't even believe in God, so it wants to eradicate any higher being or concept of any higher being other than itself, which is religion.
Thank you very much, Sully. Well, we're at the closing comment time of this program, and I couldn't be more pleased. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for your participation. We honestly wouldn't be here if it weren't for the inspiration and encouragement and leadership of one of our members. He is a household name these days, I think it's fair to say. He has helped bring about the Trump presidency. For a time, he was the strategic guide for it and has remained, I believe, a very important influence on the president, members of his administration, and certainly on those of us who have followed his guidance, his counsel, his leadership in so many different capacities, including notably as the chairman of Breitbart before he joined the Trump campaign as its chief executive officer and then became the strategic advisor to President Trump in the White House. I'm talking about, of course, Stephen Bannon, a good friend and very, very cherished colleague. Please welcome him for closing comments about the global war we're in with China.
Thank you. At 2:30 in the morning on November 9th, 2016, when the Associated Press designated Donald Trump as President-elect of the United States, this was for one reason. When I stepped into the campaign, I think with 88 days to go, depending on the poll, President Trump was 8, 10, 12, 14 points down, double digits down a bunch of battleground states. But I said, don't worry about any of those numbers. Only number that matters is Pat Goodell, the great pollster who just died, just passed away, had been doing work for years. For the first time in American history, in his polling, the American people, particularly the working class and the middle class, believed America was in decline. 70%. And specifically, they believed that our elites not only were comfortable with that, but were comfortable with managed decline. The Trump revolution started with this reaction about managed decline of the American elites, foisted upon a citizenry that for unacceptable outcomes that didn't want it, whether it's the southern border, whether it's the manufacturing jobs that left for China, whether it's these kind of pointless foreign wars we've been in, on and on and on. Those are the three pillars of what President Trump really turned around and focused on, and compared Hillary Clinton as kind of the guardian of this kind of globalist elite. Remember, after we went in that big shock, Prime Minister Abe, breaking all kind of tradition and custom, left a conference, I think the following week, and came up to talk to the then president-elect. And his warning was about China. The entire transition with Mike Flynn and others, it was to look at how we start to pivot. Not this kind of marketing ploy that the Obama administration had, this pivot to Asia, but really pivot for the great geopolitical struggle of the 21st century. That's between two very different systems. And this is what I think is Speaker Gingrich said about the infantile nature of the mainstream media, that have not defined this. But I tell you who did define it. If you go back to the third week of January in 2017, there are two speeches given. One is in Davos, my favorite place, right? The other's in Washington, D.C., a couple of blocks from here. President Xi goes to Davos and gives a speech on globalization. And he is lauded as the savior of the globalization project. It's on The Economist, the Financial Times of London, that here is a man that speaks with wisdom. Here's a man that speaks with understanding. Here's a very sophisticated voice. And a couple of days later, President Trump, the media calls it the American Carnage speech, but really, what it really was, he said, now comes the hour of action. Right? Now comes the hour of action. We will, I think the quote is, we will form new alliances and rejuvenate old ones and unite the civilized world to eradicate radical Islamic terrorism from the face of the earth. And then to pivot simultaneously in this great geopolitical struggle. And you got to remember, when he's at Davos and they're all sitting there, all the McKinsey guys, all the Booz Allen guys, all the law firms, all the accounting firms, Goldman Sachs, my old firm, all the commercial banks, all of them. They've went to the best schools in the world. They work at the smartest place in the world. They got total information at their fingertips. You're telling me they don't know about the Uyghurs? They don't know about the underground Christian church. They don't know about the underground Catholic church. They don't know about the Dalai Lama. They don't know about the social credit score. They do not know about the enslavement of the Chinese people. Sure they know. And they don't care. The Committee on 100, this highfalutin group of the best, they have their, I think, black tie dinner on Saturday night. They put out a press release on Sunday, right? This is some of the elites of the American financial and corporate community. And guess what the problem is? You know what the problem is? You're racist, right? This is about racial profiling. Tell that to the Chinese people that are enslaved. Tell that to the freedom fighters here from China. Lian Chanhan, Sasha Gong, all the great patriots that have fought for their fellow man in China. This is a scam. Allison, Graham, he and Kissinger got this, the Thucydides trap. This is the new thing, right? Thucydides trap. It's the same scam they ran back in the 70s, right? It's the reason the Committee on Present Danger existed. It's the reason Andy Marshall, when I sat down with Frank Gaffney and I talked to the great Andy Marshall, one of the architects of the victory that we had in the Cold War. Same scam. Soviet Union's the rising power. We're the declining power. We got to, I took the Naval War College. First thing Peloponnesian War. Got to understand it. Got to study Peloponnesian War. Because we're a declining power. They're the rising power. Got to have SALT. Got to have détente. Got to have rapprochement. Got to have it all. Right? Complete and total scam by the same guys. The same universities. The same elite. The same people that mock and ridicule Donald Trump every day and mock and ridicule the people in the red MAGA hats every day. The same people that brought us victory in the Cold War. What did Andy Marshall and Bill Casey say? I think there's something wrong here. I don't think the Soviet economies, I don't think they're that big. They did the analysis. This wasn't a 5% miss. It wasn't a 10% miss. The economy was half the size we had been projecting for decades. That's what the Reagan defense plan was. Frank knows this. It's economic war. We can never build a 600-ship Navy. I was a naval officer. I was a junior officer back as I came off sea duty in the South China Sea to be a junior officer in the Pentagon for the Chief of Naval Operations. See the war plan. It was an economic plan to bury them. That's what Star Wars was. Right? You think he matches conventional weapons? We'll see you one. Right? And of course, the CIA then projected it was going to take us 50 years to destroy him. It took us 8. 8. Because a very simple man with simple convictions in California said, hey, these guys are smaller than California, just like the Russians today are smaller than New York State, but this city is obsessed with them, right? They don't look at the greatest existential threat we've ever had. You can't see that. Reagan saw it. What did he tell Dick Allen? When Dick Allen, when Dick Allen said, "Don't say geopolitical, don't be Brzezinski, don't be thing," just he says geopolitical and shuts up and says, "Mr. President, what are your thoughts?" How about this, Dick? We win, they lose, right? Let's go back to that speech. Donald Trump is looked at as a barbarian. What Donald Trump is reinforcing is the Westphalian system. This is a radical, these are two systems that are incompatible. One side is going to win and one side is going to lose. President Xi, this is not the Chinese people. The Chinese people are among the most noble people that have ever walked the earth. They've been oppressed and abused for millennia. And now under a new emperor, this radical, and it's a radical cadre of the CCP, with Xi and Wan Xishan and all of them, out to suppress the Chinese people and to have a, as they say in the thought of Chairman Xi, which is now, that's the same level of Deng and Mao, the most, most important thinking international affairs in 300 years. I think that's the Treaty of Westphalia. We believe, we're nationalists, and we believe in the nation state, and we believe in the nation state as on the shoulders of a free citizenry. That those nations will work it out. What the Xi's plan is very different, and this is why the party at Davos is cheering him. It's a network effect. That's what One Belt, One Road, Made in China 2025 and 5G. That's the surface. That's what they're doing. Look, the underlying thing is they've taken the three great geopolitical strategies of the 20th century. Mackinder's, control the Eurasian landmass, number one. Mahan, control all the naval choke points like the British and the Americans, number two. And Speakman, control the rim of Asia and force your enemy off. No country, Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, Hitler, Charles, take all of them. Nobody's ever tried to do all three at one time. That's what the Chinese are doing. One Belt, One Road is just to connect the Eurasian landmass and sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. And I just came back from 5 weeks on the road. Japan, Michigan and Ohio for rallies. Brazil, we're having meeting President Bolsonaro here. And then Italy. You know what the number one conversation topic at all those places is? China. People forget Bolsonaro, the third leg of his stool was at not just law and order in traditional society. His third leg of his stool is, I don't mind China buying into Brazil. They're not going to buy Brazil. When I'm in Italy, it's just not the $30 billion of memorandums of understanding that they announce, right, with one side of the Italian government, or the $60 billion they announce in France. It's the secret deal that they talk about with the Vatican, right? That we've now given, in a crisis in the church where you can't have any lady say anything about selection of bishops, we've turned over to the most atheistic, radical regime about religion to pick bishops in the Catholic Church. So now they can concentration camps for the Uyghur. They just announced you can't, the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama has got to get their sign off, right? Got to be their guy, got to be approved. Underground Catholic Church thrown in the bus by, besides the Dalai Lama, the second most holy man in all of Asia, Cardinal Zen, who says, you are throwing living saints under the bus. The network effect. And that's what Made in China 2025, it's advanced chip design, artificial intelligence, robotics, the merger of that with One Belt, One Road, and 5G. And 5G is not just about downloading movies quicker. It is 10 orders of magnitude different. It is the Internet of Things. And most importantly, and this is what Huawei knows. Remember, Huawei's not associated with the PLA. Huawei's not some partner of the PLA. Huawei is the People's Liberation Army. And to show you how bad this situation is, when Canada, the nicest folks in the world, when they hold her so that we can extradite her, that tells you how far it's gone. 5G turns data into plutonium that can be weaponized. And they intend to weaponize it. The most depressing thing about Speaker Gingrich, who's one of the wisest men I know, was to say that we're pre the Kennan memo. If that's the case, we're in very bad shape. The purpose for the colleagues at the South China Morning Post, one of the great papers in the world, one of the single purposes of this, besides doing research and papers, we have to get out into this country and we have to get internationally. The quality of people in this room that can speak truth to the American people, speak truth to the people in the world. Remember, free people in the world don't want to be under the totalitarian regime of the radical cadre that runs the Chinese Communist Party. If you look at what the Chinese people can achieve, at the age of 21, when I pulled into Hong Kong, look at Hong Kong. When you have the rule of law, when you have freedom of speech and freedom of religion, there's nothing the Chinese people cannot accomplish. And when you look at what the Chinese have accomplished here in the United States of America, there's nothing the Chinese people cannot accomplish. President Trump needs your backing. We're engaged in this like we've never been engaged before on every level, from sending battle groups into the South China Sea to contest it through the Straits of Formosa. Tomorrow's the 40th anniversary of our alignment with Taiwan, the call of the president of whom we took when I was chief strategist. This is the defining event of our time. And 100 years from now, this is what they're going to remember us for. And what I will guarantee you, we're going to identify those members of the elite that sold us out and continue to sell out the American people and sell out the Chinese people. I'm honored to be part of this and honored to speak to you today. Thank you.
Okay, we literally have to clear the room before 3, so we're going to turn this over to our chairman, Brian Kennedy, for a quick further response to the question that was put as to next steps, and to say farewell and thank you. On my behalf, on my part at least, let me say that as well. I'm so appreciative you're here. Brian, thank you.
Thank you, Frank. I'll make it quick. First of all, I don't think I could summarize this any better than Steve Bannon did. That's exactly how we should be thinking about this. We have to get this message out to as many people as possible. I think this resonates with the American people. They want to hear it. They want to learn about this. The entire purpose of the committee really is to broaden the debate around the country. It all started in this room literally 2 weeks ago. It continues today. I want to thank all of you for being here with us, and know that we're going to be doing more of these in the coming weeks and months, and we'll make sure you're invited, and we're happy that you could be part of what we're doing. So with that, thank you very much, and the meeting today is adjourned.